There is a town in West Virginia called Kermit, population 392. In the year 2008, a single pharmacy in Kermit received 9 million hydrocodone pills. 9 million pills for a town of 392 people. Nobody stopped it. Nobody questioned it. The trucks came, the pills were dispensed, and people died. Kermit is not an anomaly, it is a data point. One of thousands of data points that together form the picture of what happened to America between 1996 and 2019. What happened to rural Ohio and Appalachian Kentucky and the mill towns of New England and the farming communities of the Midwest? What happened to the people who lived in those places, who went to their doctors with back pain or knee pain or the ordinary aches of working lives and came home with prescriptions for something called OxyContin? Something they were told was safe, something they were told was not addictive. Something the company that made it knew was both dangerous and addictive before the first pill was ever sold. The opioid crisis killed more than 500,000 Americans between 1999 and 2019, more than the Vietnam War, more than the Korean War, more than both combined. It destroyed communities with a thoroughness and a speed that war itself rarely achieves. It filled emergency rooms and prisons and foster care systems. It left children without parents and parents burying children and entire towns without a future. And at the center of it, not the only cause, not the only actor, but the originating force, the spark that lit the fire, was a single company. A family, a decision made in a boardroom in Connecticut that would cost 500,000 lives. This is the story of Purdue Pharma, the internal documents they tried to hide, the lies they told, the people they knew they were killing, and how they almost got away with it. The Sackler family did not start out as villains, or at least they did not start out looking like villains. Arthur Sackler was the eldest of three brothers who built one of the most successful pharmaceutical businesses in American history. Arthur was a psychiatrist by training, but a marketing genius by temperament. In the 1950s and 1960s, he essentially invented modern pharmaceutical advertising, the practice of marketing drugs directly to physicians through sales representatives, through medical journal advertising, through the cultivation of relationships between pharmaceutical companies and the doctors who prescribed their products. The techniques Arthur Sackler developed are so standard now that it is impossible to imagine the pharmaceutical industry without them. They were not standard when he invented them. They were new, and they worked with a power that transformed the industry. Arthur died in 1987. His brothers Mortimer and Raymond inherited the pharmaceutical business, specifically Purdue Frederick, a small Connecticut company that made various medications. They eventually brought their own children and grandchildren into the business. The Sacklers were a family enterprise in the most complete sense. In 1995, Purdue began the clinical trials and regulatory process for a new drug, a controlled-release formulation of OxyContin, an opioid painkiller that had existed for decades, designed to provide 12 hours of pain relief from a single pill. They called it OxyContin. The FDA approved OxyContin in December 1995. It went on sale in 1996. What happened in the decade that followed is documented, not in the accounts of victims, not in the allegations of prosecutors, but in Purdue's own internal documents, emails, memos, marketing plans, sales reports that were eventually obtained through litigation and that tell a story that the company spent enormous resources trying to prevent the public from reading. The central lie of OxyContin was simple. Purdue told doctors, told patients, told regulators, and told the public that OxyContin was less addictive than other opioid painkillers. They claimed that the controlled-release formulation, the mechanism that released the drug slowly over 12 hours, meant that it produced less of the euphoric effect that drives addiction. Less euphoria meant less addiction potential. Less addiction potential meant it was safer to prescribe than existing opioids. This claim was on the label. The FDA-approved label for OxyContin included language saying that the controlled-release formulation was believed to reduce the abuse potential of the drug. The word "believed" is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, because Purdue did not have clinical evidence that OxyContin was less addictive. They had a hypothesis, they had a theory, they did not have proof. And by the time OxyContin had been on the market for a few years, they had growing evidence that the theory was wrong. The controlled release mechanism only worked if the pill was swallowed whole. If you crushed it, which was trivially easy, which anyone with a pill crusher or even a spoon could do, the entire 12-hour dose was released at once. A single crushed OxyContin pill delivered an oxycodone dose equivalent to what a legitimate patient might take over an entire day. Crushed and snorted or dissolved and injected, OxyContin produced a high that users compared to heroin. Purdue knew this. The chemistry was not complicated. Their scientists understood how the pill worked and how it could be defeated. Internal documents show that concerns about the abuse potential of crushed OxyContin were raised within the company in the late 1990s. The response was not to reformulate the pill. The response was not to warn prescribers. The response was to continue selling. The sales machine that Purdue built around OxyContin was extraordinary in its scale and its sophistication. In 1996, when OxyContin launched, Purdue had a sales force of approximately 318 representatives. By 2000, that number had grown to over 900. These representatives were paid salaries and bonuses tied directly to the number of OxyContin prescriptions written in their territories. The more pills their doctors prescribed, the more money the representatives made. The bonuses were significant. Sales representatives could earn tens of thousands of dollars above their base salary through the bonus structure. In the year 2001 alone, Purdue paid out $40 million in bonuses to its sales force. What did the sales representatives do with this incentive structure? They did what any rational person would do. They worked to increase prescriptions. The internal documents show the methods in specific and damning detail. Sales representatives were trained to target high-prescribing doctors, to identify physicians who were already writing significant numbers of opioid prescriptions, and to prioritize visits to those doctors. They were given detailed information about the prescribing patterns of individual physicians, obtained through data purchased from pharmacy benefit managers, which told them exactly how many and what kinds of opioid prescriptions each doctor was writing. They were trained to overcome objections. When doctors raised concerns about addiction, representatives were given scripts. They were taught to cite the controlled release formulation as evidence of lower addiction potential. They were taught to tell doctors that studies showed fewer than 1% of patients who took OxyContin for legitimate pain became addicted. That statistic, less than 1%, was real. It came from a real study, a letter published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980, describing the experience of a Boston hospital in monitoring patients who received opioids while hospitalized. The letter was 5 sentences long. It described a specific, limited population, inpatients receiving opioids under medical supervision, and drew a narrow conclusion about that specific population. Purdue's sales representatives used it as a blanket claim that opioids were essentially non-addictive. The authors of the original letter eventually wrote a follow-up, published decades later, noting that their brief observation had been cited more than 600 times in the medical literature and that it had been grotesquely misrepresented. They had never said what Purdue's representatives were saying they had said. The doctors were not passive recipients of this sales campaign. Purdue understood that physicians were the gatekeepers. The pills could only reach patients if doctors prescribed them. The sales campaign was therefore not just about information, it was about relationships. Purdue spent millions of dollars on what the industry calls speaker programs, events where physicians were paid to give talks about pain management to other physicians. These programs were real in the sense that actual medical presentations were made. They were also, in practice, a mechanism for paying doctors to be advocates for OxyContin. Physicians who participated in speaker programs were paid fees ranging from a few $100s to several $1,000s per event. They were flown to resort locations for conferences, they were taken to dinners, they received educational grants. The company cultivated relationships with the physicians who were most influential in shaping prescribing practices. Pain specialists, department heads, the doctors that other doctors looked to for guidance. These relationships worked. The physicians who received the most attention from Purdue's sales force and speaker programs prescribed dramatically more OxyContin than those who did not. The data was in Purdue's own tracking systems. They could see in real time that their investment in physician relationships was translating directly into increased prescriptions. They responded by investing more. Between 1996 and 2001, Purdue spent more than $200 million on marketing OxyContin. This was an extraordinary sum for a single drug. It paid off. OxyContin sales grew from $45 million in its first year to $1.1 billion in 2000. By 2010, it was generating more than $3 billion annually. OxyContin became one of the most profitable pharmaceutical products in American history. The Sackler family, as the private owners of Purdue, received dividends from those profits. Between 2008 and 2018, the family withdrew approximately $10 billion from the company. $10 billion. While people died. The dying did not take long to begin. The first reports of OxyContin abuse appeared within months of the drug's launch. Emergency rooms in rural areas began seeing patients presenting with OxyContin overdoses. Police departments began reporting OxyContin theft and diversion. Physicians began contacting Purdue with concerns about patients who had become addicted. These reports were not ignored internally, they were tracked. Purdue maintained detailed records of adverse event reports, the industry term for reports of bad outcomes associated with a drug. The internal documents show that the company was receiving and logging reports of addiction, overdose, and death associated with OxyContin from the very earliest period of the drug's commercial life. What the documents also show is how those reports were handled. Sales representatives who received complaints from doctors about patient addiction were given guidance on how to respond. They were told to express sympathy and concern. They were told to emphasize that the problem was not the drug, but the patient. That patients who became addicted were abusing the medication, not using it as directed. They were told to point out that OxyContin's controlled-release formulation meant that patients who took the pill as directed, swallowed whole, were protected from its abuse potential. The implication was clear. If a patient became addicted, the fault lay with the patient, not the drug. This framing was deliberate. Internal communications show Purdue executives discussing how to manage the growing problem of OxyContin abuse without triggering regulatory attention or reducing prescribing. The goal was to contain the public relations problem while maintaining sales momentum. In some cases, the documents show Purdue was aware of specific doctors who were prescribing OxyContin in ways that were clearly outside any legitimate medical purpose. Pill mills, in the parlance of the era, clinics that existed primarily to write opioid prescriptions for cash payments. The documents show that Purdue's sales representatives continued to call on some of these doctors even after the company had been alerted to concerns about their prescribing practices. The pills kept flowing. Fashion. In 2001, the FDA required Purdue to update OxyContin's label. The change was significant. The new label removed the language claiming that the controlled-release formulation reduced abuse potential. The evidence for that claim had never been solid, and the accumulating reports of abuse had made the claim increasingly untenable. Purdue complied with the label change, and then they continued selling the drug with essentially the same marketing approach. The first major legal reckoning came in 2007. Federal prosecutors in Virginia charged Purdue Frederick, the parent company, with misbranding OxyContin by claiming it was less addictive and less subject to abuse than other opioids. 3 senior executives, the company's president, its top lawyer, and its former chief medical officer, pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges of misbranding. The company paid $600 million in fines. The executives paid a combined $34 million in personal fines. $600 million. Sounds like an enormous sum. In the context of OxyContin's revenue, it was less than 6 months of sales. The executives who pleaded guilty faced no prison time. They continued to be employed or to collect pensions from the company. The message the settlement sent was clear. You could market a drug in ways that killed hundreds of thousands of people. You could pay a fine. You could move on. Purdue moved on. OxyContin sales continued to grow after 2007. The company launched new marketing initiatives, the sales force was maintained, the speaker programs continued, and the deaths continued. The second legal reckoning was harder to escape. By 2017, the opioid crisis had become impossible to ignore as a national issue. More than 70,000 Americans were dying annually from drug overdoses, with opioids involved in the majority of deaths. The epidemic had moved from rural Appalachia to suburban communities across the country. It had generated a wave of journalism, documentary films, congressional hearings, and state investigations that kept the story in the public consciousness. In 2018 and 2019, a wave of lawsuits arrived. More than 2,000 state and local governments sued Purdue and other opioid manufacturers and distributors. State attorneys general filed their own suits. The litigation was enormous in its scope and complexity. What the litigation produced through the discovery process that forces defendants to turn over internal documents was the evidence that had never been fully public. The emails, the memos, the marketing plans, the sales tracking data, the internal discussions about adverse events, the communications showing that executives knew what was happening and made decisions that prioritized sales over safety. Some of these documents had been available in limited form since the 2007 settlement, but the full scope of what Purdue's internal records showed had never been completely public. Now it was becoming public, and it was worse than most people had imagined. One particularly damaging set of documents came from Massachusetts, where Attorney General Maura Healey filed a suit in 2019 that named the Sackler family members personally, not just the company, but the individual family members who had owned and directed it. The Massachusetts complaint drew directly on internal documents to describe specific decisions made by specific people. It described board meetings at which family members had been briefed on the company's response to the abuse crisis. It described emails in which Richard Sackler, who had served as president and then chairman of Purdue, discussed the company's approach to managing addiction concerns. One email from Richard Sackler, written in 2001 as the abuse crisis was becoming publicly visible, discussed the problem of patients who had become addicted to OxyContin. His language, preserved in the internal record, described addicts as the culpable party, as people who had chosen to abuse the medication rather than as victims of a drug that had been marketed to minimize their concerns about addiction. The document revealed something about the mindset of the people running the company. They had constructed a framework in which the consequences of their product were the fault of the people experiencing those consequences. The drug was not the problem. The patients were the problem. This framework had policy implications. If addicts were the problem, the solution was to pursue addicts through law enforcement, through prescription monitoring, through policies that restricted access for people identified as abusers, not to change the drug, not to change the marketing, not to accept responsibility for what the company had created. Outside the boardrooms and the courtrooms, the human cost was accumulating in ways that statistics cannot fully capture. In 2001, a woman in Virginia named Jill Skolick lost her son Sean to an OxyContin overdose. He was 19 years old. He had been prescribed OxyContin after a football injury. He had become addicted. He had died. Jill Skolick became one of the most persistent advocates for accountability in the opioid crisis. She testified before Congress. She participated in legal proceedings. She spent years pushing for the kind of public reckoning that the 2007 settlement had failed to produce. Her story was one story among hundreds of thousands. Every statistic in the opioid epidemic had a name behind it. Every name had a family. Every family had a specific moment when they understood that something had gone wrong. A phone call, an ambulance, a hospital waiting room, a funeral. The communities that were hardest hit were not random. They were disproportionately working-class communities that had experienced economic decline, places where jobs in manufacturing or mining or agriculture had disappeared, places where the population was older and more likely to have the kind of chronic pain conditions that OxyContin was marketed to treat, places where the healthcare infrastructure was thin and the physicians who prescribed were often seeing more patients than they could adequately manage. Purdue's sales force knew these communities. Their data told them where the high-prescribing doctors were, and high-prescribing doctors were disproportionately in areas where patients had fewer options and more pain. The sales force followed the data. The pills followed the sales force. In Mingo County, West Virginia, one of the poorest counties in the United States, pharmacies received more than 3 million opioid pills in a single year for a population of 25,000. If every man, woman, and child in the county had taken every pill, each person would have received 120 pills. Most of those pills did not go to the people they were prescribed for. In 2019, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy. The filing was not a sign of financial failure. The company was profitable. It was a legal maneuver designed to consolidate the thousands of lawsuits into a single proceeding where a settlement could be negotiated. The bankruptcy process took years and generated enormous controversy. The central dispute was over how much money the Sackler family would pay and whether family members would receive legal immunity from further civil suits in exchange for their contribution to the settlement. The numbers eventually agreed to were large in absolute terms and contested in terms of whether they constituted genuine accountability. The family agreed to pay approximately $6 billion over a period of years. The company itself would be dissolved and its assets used to create a public benefit company focused on addiction treatment. In exchange, family members received broad immunity from future civil suits by states and local governments, immunity that the Supreme Court of the United States ultimately struck down in 2024, ruling that bankruptcy courts could not grant that immunity to third parties who had not themselves filed for bankruptcy. The criminal resolution was separate. In 2020, Purdue pleaded guilty to federal criminal charges, conspiracy to defraud the United States and to violate the federal anti-kickback statute. The company agreed to pay more than $8 billion in criminal penalties. Given that the company was in bankruptcy, the practical meaning of that $8 billion figure was contested. Individual criminal charges against Sackler family members never materialized at the federal level. The family members who had run the company, who had received the emails and attended the board meetings and collected the dividends, faced no criminal prosecution. This outcome generated enormous frustration among advocates, victims' families, and many legal observers. The argument for prosecution was not complicated. The internal documents showed that people in positions of authority within the company had been informed of the consequences of their marketing practices and had made decisions that prioritized revenue over safety. In other industries, in other contexts, this kind of documented corporate decision-making had resulted in individual criminal liability. In the opioid case, it did not. The town of Kermit, West Virginia, is still there. The pharmacy that received 9 million pills is no longer operating. The opioid crisis that began in the late 1990s has evolved. Prescription opioid abuse peaked and then was partly replaced by heroin as prescription monitoring programs made pills harder to obtain, and heroin was then partly replaced by fentanyl, a synthetic opioid exponentially more potent than anything Purdue ever made. The death toll has not stopped. The crisis that Purdue helped create became a crisis that now has a momentum of its own, fueled by supply chains and social conditions, and the basic reality that addiction is not cured by changing the drug available to people who are addicted. The Sackler family has spent years attempting to manage the damage to their reputation. They have removed their name from museum wings and university buildings that had been named in recognition of their philanthropic donations. Institutions that once competed to display the Sackler name have quietly removed it. The art world has grappled with what it means to have accepted money from a family that generated that money through the opioid epidemic. The cultural donations were real. The galleries and scholarships and fellowships funded by Sackler money were real. The deaths that funded them were also real. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York removed the Sackler name from its galleries in 2021. The Tate Galleries in London followed. Oxford University, Harvard University, and dozens of other institutions have distanced themselves from Sackler donations or returned them. The reputational campaign the family has fought has been extensive and expensive. It has not been entirely unsuccessful. The name is not yet synonymous in the broad public consciousness with what the internal documents show it should be synonymous with. Perhaps because the story is complex, because the opioid crisis has many causes and many actors, because the regulatory failures that allowed OxyContin to be marketed as it was involved, not just Purdue, but the FDA, the medical profession, the pharmaceutical distribution system, and the political environment that made aggressive drug regulation difficult. All of that is true, the complexity is real, and it does not change what the internal documents show. There is a memo in Purdue's internal records from 1997. It was written by a member of the company's sales force in response to concerns being raised about OxyContin abuse in Appalachian communities. The memo was sent up the chain of command. The response it received was not an instruction to investigate the concerns or to modify the marketing approach. The response was an instruction to continue selling, to continue the speaker programs, to continue the bonus structure that rewarded representatives for increasing prescriptions, to continue telling doctors that the drug was safe. One memo, one decision, repeated thousands of times by dozens of people across more than a decade. Each decision was small. Each person making it could tell themselves that they were following instructions, that the drug had been approved by the FDA, that the company's legal department had signed off, that the doctors making the prescribing decisions were the ones with the medical training, that their job was just to provide information. These rationalizations are human. They are the rationalizations that allow ordinary people to participate in extraordinary harm. They are the rationalizations that appear in every documented case of corporate wrongdoing at Enron and Volkswagen and every other company that found itself eventually explaining its internal documents to prosecutors. The people who made those decisions are still alive, with some exceptions. They live in houses purchased with dividends from OxyContin sales. Their children went to schools whose tuitions were paid with that money. Some of them have given interviews in which they have expressed regret about the crisis while disputing the extent of their own responsibility. The 500,000 people who died cannot give interviews. The name of every person who died from an opioid overdose between 1999 and 2019, every single name is a consequence of decisions that were made in boardrooms and memoranda and sales training sessions. It is a consequence of a company that knew what it was doing and did it anyway, for as long as it could, for as much money as it could extract. The internal documents are not allegations. They are records. They are emails written by real people who knew what they knew and wrote it down and sent it to each other across corporate servers that they presumably assumed would never be examined by the public. They were wrong about that. The documents exist. The names on those documents are real. The decisions those documents record were made by human beings who are accountable for those decisions in the ways that human beings are accountable, morally, if not always, legally, historically, if not always, immediately. The story of the opioid crisis is not finished. The drugs are still there. The deaths are still happening. The communities that were hollowed out by 20 years of addiction are still trying to recover. What is finished, or at least what has been exposed, is the lie. The lie that OxyContin was safe, that it was not addictive, that the people who became addicted were the problem and not the product. The internal documents killed that lie, but they could not bring back the 500,000 people who died before anyone read them. That number, 500,000. Each one a person, each one a story that ended in a way it did not have to end. Each one someone whose death was calculated in a spreadsheet somewhere as an acceptable cost of doing business. The documents are in the public record now. The Sackler name is coming off the walls. And somewhere in Kermit, West Virginia, a town of 392 people is still trying to understand what happened to it. The pills are gone. The damage is not.